one of the best things that ever happened to me was receiving your book on Jeffrey MacDonald to review from the Wall Street Journal. It opened my eyes to how counter-narratives have a taxonomy, how you can follow them from case to case. I don't know if you're still pursuing that case or...
I am pursuing it in the sense that my publishers have asked me to do another edition of the book, so I am rewriting parts of the book, and then there's an edition based on a recent hearing in North Carolina about the case. So that is going to be added to the mix. So I guess the answer is yes, I'm sorry.
Right, well, I'm glad to hear that. Although I think your first edition of it really says everything there is that I can think of to say. Basically, police have a choice. They can either look for an intruder, which is a lot of work, or they could look at the one surviving family member, indict him and convict him, which is a much easier choice. So I think we see this in the Amanda Knox case. We see this in the Sam Shepard case. There's a tendency, I don't know if you agree, but with police, to basically take the person closest to the crime, which requires the least imagination.
I would put it slightly differently. I think often there's a tendency to take that explanation which involves the least amount of thought, and often an explanation that sets in early on and persists despite any countervailing evidence. It persists despite everything. You mentioned, someone should do at some point a taxonomy of murder cases, because there are all of these different kinds, and maybe in fact you have done just that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I've tried, and I was greatly inspired to continue trying when I read your book. But you know, I think you're right. You have cases where they find a shooter, and then they have to decide whether someone paid him or someone was behind him or he was a loner. This goes back to the Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth. Yes, he shot Lincoln. There were 2 other assassination attempts that night by associates of Booth. So was this, as the original finding of the U.S. Military Commission was this a plot to decapitate the U.S. government? Or was John Wilkes Booth crazy? So you have that kind of taxonomy. You have, you know, again, getting back to your case, or you have a number of cases, but getting back to the MacDonald case.
And I too might be a case, who knows?
Okay, we have cases in common. But, you know, with Amanda Knox, they first basically decided that she was lying. She was lying. She did lie to the police. It's not that uncommon if you don't have a lawyer and you don't have Miranda rights, as exists in Italy, that under tremendous pressure, you lie.
You don't even have to have tremendous pressure. Lying is ubiquitous. I mean, if you find something that any account given by anybody that isn't riddled with lies, really it's probably not given by anyone I know or anyone I've read about. The presence of lies is not somehow proof of anything, except that people tell inconsistent, contradictory, confusing stories.
Just in support of what you're saying, you know, DNA has given us another prism to look at past cases. And Project Innocence by Barry Scheck, and they found 250 cases where people were wrongly convicted and put in prison. Of those, they found that in 40 of the cases where people had confessed to crimes that they didn't commit. So this basically, I think, yes, people lie all the time. And secondly, people try to be accommodating. They try to tell the police interrogator something that he wants to hear. In Amanda Knox's case, she simply wanted to go home. She had been there for 12 hours. She was exhausted. She was a 20-year-old girl. She was high on pot. She wanted to go home. So she told them what they wanted to hear, that they had basically, a black man had been seen running out. So the only black man she could think of was, it was very unfortunate to him, was the owner of the bar where she worked, Patrick Lumumba. So she said, yeah, he came home with me and killed my roommate. She then later repudiated the statement and said she made it all up, which it turned out she did. He luckily had an alibi, an ironclad alibi, even though he spent about 3 months in prison. But so he was released. Now they actually found the murderer. They actually found a guy whose DNA was found in the woman who was murdered, whose fingerprints were found in the room. All the fingerprints belonged to him. The palm prints belonged entirely to him. His sneaker print was in her blood, so they knew he had left the room after she was dead. And yet they persisted. This is the inertia that you mentioned. They persisted with the Amanda Knox and simply said, well, she was part of a devil's cult, which he also was part of. So that managed to go on for, she was in prison for 4 years.
Yeah. And from what I understand, that they intend to pursue the case further.
Of course.
The prosecutors in Italy haven't really quite given up. It's not that I think that every prosecution in the end produces a miscarriage of justice. I don't. But what is really aggravating, I think that's probably the right word to me over the years, is that often what we take to be evidence isn't really evidence of anything. And often real evidence goes uncollected, unobserved, unconsidered. When I talked about the taxonomy of criminal cases, we're all familiar with cases that are just simply unsolved murders, where really there are no suspects. No one really is clear at all who might have committed the crime. Then there are cases where it seems to be a slam dunk. We have a suspect. It seems to be absolutely clear that the evidence points to that one suspect, to his guilt, and to none other. And then there are cases which I myself have been involved with, both the Jeffrey MacDonald case and the case that I made a movie about years ago, The Thin Blue Line, where you have two competing narratives about what happened. There are two stories. And two suspects as well. In the MacDonald case, you could say there's Jeffrey MacDonald and then a collection of suspects who could have been involved with the murders. And so you have this choice between competing narratives, A and B. And you would think that if you scrutinize evidence carefully enough, closely enough, that you will be able to come to some kind of conclusion about what really happened. Because the world is constantly, I guess this is the transfer theory of Locard, the world is constantly exfoliating. It's producing evidence of itself. If you look closely enough at a crime scene or a criminal, shouldn't you be able to determine what really happened?
You know, Edmond Locard, who was, I guess, the French Sherlock Holmes, and who basically wrote the classic book that we now see crime CSI-type programs on, you know, he said that if someone commits a crime, he has to transfer part of himself, his fingerprints, his, it was before DNA, his blood, his fibers on his coat. So with comparative microscopes, which developed in the early 20th century, you basically should come to this answer. Again, in the Amanda Knox case,